What do you do when the ground beneath a town gives up something that shouldn't exist? That is not a dramatic question. It is a practical one. Because in 1907, that is exactly what happened. And the people who were present that day had no framework for what they were looking at. They were not scientists. They were not archaeologists. They were workers doing a job, breaking ground for what was supposed to be a routine excavation, the kind of work that happened in hundreds of towns across the country during that period. Unremarkable, scheduled, expected to produce nothing more unusual than rock, soil, and the occasional buried pipe or foundation remnant from an earlier structure. But this excavation did not stay routine. At some point during the digging, the workers broke through a compacted layer of earth that had clearly not been disturbed in a very long time. What sat beneath that layer was solid, dense, and when they began clearing the material around it, the shape that emerged did not match anything they had encountered before. It was not a collapsed wall. It was not a buried boulder with an irregular surface. It had structure. It had form. And the more earth they removed, the more that form resembled something deeply familiar to anyone who has ever looked at an anatomy illustration or a natural history exhibit. It looked like a skull, not in a vague, approximate way, not in the way that a rock formation might, under certain lighting conditions, produce a passing resemblance to something biological. The workers described defined curves. They described what appeared to be orbital cavities, the spaces where eyes would sit in a living face. They described a structural arrangement that suggested not random mineral formation, but organized, proportionate anatomy. And then there was the size. Estimates from the accounts that survived placed the skull at approximately 30 feet in length. That number is worth sitting with for a moment, because it does not fit into any recognized category of living or extinct creature. The largest known animals to have existed on this planet, the great sauropod dinosaurs, the massive marine reptiles of the Mesozoic, did not produce skull structures of that configuration. A 30-foot skull with human-like orbital geometry and structured bone formation belongs to no species in the documented fossil record. It does not correspond to any known anatomy. It exists outside the boundaries of what paleontology or biology can currently explain. And yet the workers were not describing something they imagined. Multiple people were present. The accounts, while inconsistent in certain details, agree on the fundamental observation. Something large and structured came out of the ground that day. Something that prompted them to stop working and call for someone with more authority to come and look at what they had found. That is where the straightforward part of the story ends. Because what happened after the workers stopped and the officials arrived is significantly harder to piece together. The record, which should become clearer at that point, more formal, more documented, more institutional, instead becomes murkier. The accounts begin to diverge. Details that should be consistent are not. The questions that any reasonable person would ask about a discovery of that nature start going unanswered, and they stay unanswered in a way that is difficult to explain if the discovery itself was simple and unremarkable. Who arrived first after the workers reported the find? The accounts do not agree. One source suggests local government officials came before anyone else. Another account implies that a representative from outside the town was already present, or arrived with unusual speed. The timeline of who knew what and when does not assemble cleanly from the surviving documentation. What were the exact measurements? The 30-foot estimate appears in more than one account, but the method of measurement is never described. No measuring instrument is mentioned. No formal survey notation exists in any record that researchers have been able to locate. The number appears as a statement, not as the result of a documented process. What happened to the physical object itself? This is perhaps the most straightforward question, and it is the one with the least satisfactory answer. A structure of that scale, pulled from beneath an inhabited town, would have required significant effort to uncover, examine, and move. It could not have quietly disappeared, and yet no receiving institution has been identified. No transfer record has surfaced. No storage manifest, no correspondence file, no academic note referencing its arrival anywhere has appeared in the publicly accessible record. This is where the story starts to feel less like a gap in the historical record and more like a shape. Gaps are random. They appear where information was never created, or where it was created and then lost through the normal deterioration of time. But a consistent absence, The same type of information missing across multiple points in the same case begins to suggest something more deliberate than entropy. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Consider what documentation a discovery of this kind should have produced in 1907. Local newspaper coverage beyond the initial report. Official correspondence between town authorities and state or federal bodies. A response from at least one scientific or academic institution, given the scale of what was described. Possibly a visit from a surveyor or a geologist commissioned to assess the find. A decision record, written evidence of whoever decided what to do with the object and where it should go. None of that appears. Not in fragmentary form. Not in partial records, waiting to be cross-referenced. The secondary documentation that should surround the initial discovery simply does not exist in any form that has been made publicly available. Some researchers who have looked at this case suggest the simplest explanation. Records from that era were poorly kept. Local governments in small towns did not maintain systematic archives. Workers gave oral accounts that were transcribed inconsistently, if at all. The find may have been dismissed quickly, moved quietly, and forgotten before anyone thought to create a formal record of what was done with it. That explanation is reasonable. It is the kind of explanation that fits the general sloppiness of early 20th century documentation practices in rural areas, and it might be fully sufficient if this case existed in isolation. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the 1907 discovery does not exist in isolation. It exists within a broader pattern of similar finds from the same era. Large skeletal material, unusual proportions, initial local documentation, followed by transfer to unnamed or unspecified institutional custody, followed by the effective disappearance of the material from any accessible record. That pattern appears in Ohio in the 1880s. It appears in accounts from the Midwest in the 1890s. It appears in surveyor notes and county records and small circulation newspapers from across a wide geographic area, all describing a similar sequence of events, all ending in the same silence. A single case with missing records is a historical accident. A repeated pattern of missing records across different locations and different decades raises a different kind of question. Not necessarily a sinister one, but a structural one. What was the system that received these materials? How did it operate? And why did it consistently produce the same outcome? The find, the transfer, and the silence, regardless of where the discovery was made or who initially reported it. At first, it seems normal, but there is a problem. By 1907, the infrastructure for receiving and centralizing unusual archaeological finds in the United States was already well established. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology had been operating since the 1870s. Field agents were active across the country. Regional networks connected local officials and newspaper editors with institutional representatives in ways that were not publicly visible but were functionally efficient. When something unusual surfaced, there were people who heard about it quickly, and there were channels through which that something could move from a local excavation site into institutional custody with relatively little public documentation. This is not speculation. It is documented institutional history. The Bureau's acquisition records from this period show exactly this kind of regional collection activity. What is less documented is the selection process. What was acquired and what was not. What was recorded and what was allowed to fade. The institutional record shows the destinations, but not always the journey, and not always the decisions that were made along the way. And so the 1907 skull, whatever it was, whatever its actual dimensions, whatever its true nature, entered this system, or it did not enter any system, and it was simply lost. Either possibility is technically consistent with the surviving record, because the surviving record is not sufficient to confirm or rule out either scenario. What it does confirm is the absence. Something was found. People were present. Accounts were written. And then the object that prompted all of that attention vanished from the documentary record as completely as if it had never been found at all. That raises a simple question. A question that does not require any particular theory about what the skull was or where it came from. Simply this. If the discovery was unremarkable, if it was a misidentified geological formation, quickly examined and dismissed, why does the record look the way it does? Unremarkable dismissals leave traces. They leave the notation that something was examined and found to be ordinary. They leave the name of whoever made that determination. They leave at least the outline of a conclusion. The record from 1907 does not contain a conclusion. It contains a beginning, the workers, the shape, the initial accounts, and then it contains nothing. No conclusion, no dismissal, no transfer confirmation, no scientific note, no follow-up of any kind that has been located in over a century of the relevant archives being available to researchers. The ground gave something up in 1907. The people who were present described it. The accounts that survived agree on the fundamental shape of what was seen, even where they disagree on the details. And then the story stops. Not with an answer, not with a resolution, with a silence that has lasted more than 100 years and shows no signs of breaking on its own. What was buried beneath that town? The record does not say. What happened to it after the workers stepped back and the officials moved in? The record does not say that either. And the record silence, at this point, is itself the most consistent piece of information the case has produced. Something came out of the ground. The question of what it was has never been answered. And the question of why that answer does not exist is, if anything, more interesting than the object itself. When something unusual is found, the first response is rarely silence. There is almost always an explanation. It arrives quickly. It sounds reasonable. And in most cases it is enough to settle the immediate question and move the conversation forward. That is not necessarily a failure of inquiry. It is how information processing works in practice. A find is made, a framework is applied, and the framework either fits or it does not. If it fits well enough, the case closes. If it does not fit cleanly, the case stays open, usually quietly, usually without much public attention. In the case of the 1907 discovery, an explanation did emerge. It took some time to be formally articulated, but the general direction of the official position became clear relatively quickly. The find, according to those who weighed in on it from a scientific and institutional standpoint, was most likely the result of two intersecting factors. The first was a well-documented psychological phenomenon. The second was a geological process that has been observed and studied in sedimentary environments around the world. The psychological explanation centers on something called pareidolia. It is a term that most people recognize, even if they have never heard the word itself. Pareidolia is the tendency of the human brain to perceive familiar patterns, particularly faces and human forms, in random or ambiguous visual information. You see a face in the grain of a wooden door. You see a figure in the shadows on a wall. You look at a cloud formation and recognize the outline of an animal or a person. This is not imagination in the creative sense. It is a deeply embedded cognitive function, one that researchers believe developed as a survival mechanism. Recognizing a face or a human silhouette quickly, even in imperfect conditions, has obvious advantages. The brain is wired to find these patterns, and it finds them even when they are not objectively there. This phenomenon is extremely well documented. Studies have demonstrated it across cultures, age groups, and sensory modalities. It is not a sign of poor intelligence or inadequate observation. It affects trained scientists and untrained workers alike, though the latter may be more susceptible under conditions of stress, excitement, or poor visibility. And excavation conditions in 1907 were, by any reasonable standard, not optimal for precise visual analysis. Underground work in that era relied on lanterns or torches. Dust and debris would have been present. The physical effort of the work itself affects perception. These are real variables that any honest assessment of the eyewitness accounts has to take into consideration. The geological side of the explanation is equally grounded in documented science. The specific formation type most frequently cited in connection with cases like this is a concretion. Concretions are naturally occurring mineral masses that form through a process of chemical precipitation. In simple terms, minerals dissolved in groundwater gradually deposit around a central point, often an organic object like a shell, a bone fragment, or a piece of wood, and over time build up into a dense, rounded mass. The process can take thousands of years. The result is a solid, often surprisingly symmetrical object embedded within the surrounding sedimentary rock. What makes concretions relevant to cases of apparent bone or skull identification is their surface texture and shape. Under certain conditions, the mineral layering process produces forms that closely resemble biological structures, rounded protrusions, curved surfaces, indentations that look, at first glance, like eye sockets or joint cavities. Iron-rich concretions, in particular, tend to develop a coloration and density that resembles fossilized bone. And when they form at significant scale, which they do, in the right geological environments, the resemblance can be striking enough to mislead even experienced observers in poor lighting conditions. Limestone-heavy regions are especially prone to producing these formations. Limestone is a sedimentary rock composed largely of calcium carbonate, and it dissolves and redeposits under the influence of groundwater in ways that create complex, unexpected shapes over geological timescales. Regions with extensive limestone bedrock have produced concretions and erosion formations that have been mistaken for everything from prehistoric tools to architectural ruins. It is a documented and recurring phenomenon in geological fieldwork. The 1907 excavation site sits within a broader geological region where these kinds of formations are not unusual. So the official explanation, when laid out carefully, is not a dismissal. It is a reasoned application of known science to an ambiguous find. Untrained workers, operating under difficult conditions, encountered a large mineral formation with an unusual shape. Their perception of that shape was influenced by the cognitive tendency to recognize familiar forms in ambiguous visual information. The result was a genuine but mistaken identification. The skull was not a skull. The eye sockets were natural cavities. The apparent bone structure was mineral layering, and the scale, which was the most striking element of the initial accounts, was either a product of perceptual distortion in a confined underground space or was exaggerated in the retelling as the story passed from person to person. It is a tidy explanation. It accounts for the core facts without requiring any unusual assumptions. And for a period of time, it appeared to be sufficient. The case did not become a major academic controversy. It did not generate sustained scientific debate. It was absorbed into the category of historical curiosities, the kind of thing that gets mentioned briefly in discussions of unusual finds and then set aside in favor of more tractable questions. But this is where it becomes unclear, because a tidy explanation is only satisfying if it actually accounts for all the available information. And when the 1907 case is examined more carefully, certain details do not sit comfortably within the framework the official explanation provides. The first issue is specificity. The pareidolia explanation works well for vague resemblances. It explains why someone might look at an irregular rock surface and see a face, or why a cliff formation might appear to take on a human silhouette from a certain angle. But the accounts from 1907 do not describe a vague resemblance. They describe structured features, orbital cavities with defined edges, curved bone-like surfaces with consistent proportions, a form that multiple observers, independently, described in similar structural terms. Pareidolia tends to produce subjective, variable responses. Two people looking at the same cloud formation will often describe entirely different shapes. But the 1907 accounts show a degree of consistency that sits awkwardly alongside the pareidolia explanation. If each observer was simply projecting a familiar pattern onto an ambiguous form, the descriptions should vary more than they do. The second issue is scale. Concretions form at many sizes, and large concretions are not unheard of. But a concretion of sufficient scale to be described as 30 feet in length, with bilateral symmetry and proportionate internal structure, falls well outside the normal range of documented concretion formations. The geological literature on concretions includes examples of impressive size, some reaching several meters, but the specific combination of scale, symmetry, and structural detail described in the 1907 accounts does not have a straightforward parallel in the documented record of natural mineral formations. That does not make it impossible, but it does mean the geological explanation requires the 1907 formation to be an unusually extreme example of a known process, at the very outer boundary of what that process is documented to produce. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because if the object was at the outer boundary of what natural processes can produce, it should have attracted significant scientific interest precisely because of that. An exceptionally large, unusually symmetrical, biologically resemblant concretion would be notable in its own right. It would be worth documenting, preserving, and studying as an example of natural formation processes operating at unusual scale. The geological community of 1907 was active and well-organized. There were journals, professional societies, and institutional channels for exactly this kind of documentation. A find of that character, even fully explained as a natural formation, should have generated some record within those channels. It did not. Or if it did, that record has not surfaced in any publicly accessible form. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Not because the science behind it is wrong. The science is sound. Pareidolia is real. Concretions are real. Geological misidentification is a genuine and recurring issue in field observation. All of that is true. The problem is not with the explanation itself. The problem is with how the explanation was applied. A proper application of the official framework would have produced documentation. It would have produced a formal assessment, a geological survey, a note in an institutional record somewhere confirming that what was found had been examined, identified as a natural formation, and disposed of accordingly. That is what scientific dismissal looks like when it is done correctly. It leaves a record of the dismissal. The 1907 case does not have that record. What it has is the initial accounts and then silence. Not the silence of a case properly closed and filed. The silence of a case that stopped generating documentation at a very early stage, before the normal institutional processes had time to produce the secondary record that should accompany them. Some researchers argue this distinction matters more than it initially appears. A genuine geological misidentification, handled through normal channels, would have left traces. The absence of those traces suggests that whatever happened to the find, it did not follow the normal sequence of identification, assessment, and formal dismissal that the official explanation implies. Others disagree. They point to the genuine limitations of rural record-keeping in 1907. They note that many cases from this period simply did not generate sustained documentation, not because anything unusual was happening, but because the institutional infrastructure for creating and preserving records was inconsistent and often inadequate. Under this view, the silence is ordinary. It reflects the reality of how information was managed in that era, not anything specific about this case. Both of these positions are defensible. Neither can be conclusively proven with the available evidence. And that uncertainty is itself significant, because it means the official explanation, while scientific limestone-heavy regions are especially prone to producing these formations. Limestone is a sedimentary rock composed largely of calcium carbonate, and it dissolves and redeposits under the influence of groundwater in ways that create complex, unexpected shapes over geological timescales. Regions with extensive limestone bedrock have produced concretions and erosion formations that have been mistaken for everything from prehistoric tools to architectural ruins. It is a documented and recurring phenomenon in geological fieldwork. The 1907 excavation site sits within a broader geological region where these kinds of formations are not unusual. So the official explanation, when laid out carefully, is not a dismissal. It is a reasoned application of known science to an ambiguous find. Untrained workers, operating under difficult conditions, encountered a large mineral formation with an unusual shape. Their perception of that shape was influenced by the cognitive tendency to recognize familiar forms in ambiguous visual information. The result was a genuine but mistaken identification. The skull was not a skull. The eye sockets were natural cavities. The apparent bone structure was mineral layering, and the scale, which was the most striking element of the initial accounts, was either a product of perceptual distortion in a confined underground space or was exaggerated in the retelling as the story passed from person to person. It is a tidy explanation. It accounts for the core facts without requiring any unusual assumptions. And for a period of time, it appeared to be sufficient. The case did not become a major academic controversy. It did not generate sustained scientific debate. It was absorbed into the category of historical curiosities, the kind of thing that gets mentioned briefly in discussions of unusual finds and then set aside in favor of more tractable questions. But this is where it becomes unclear. because a tidy explanation is only satisfying if it actually accounts for all the available information. And when the 1907 case is examined more carefully, certain details do not sit comfortably within the framework the official explanation provides. The first issue is specificity. The pareidolia explanation works well for vague resemblances. It explains why someone might look at an irregular rock surface and see a face, or why a cliff formation might appear to take on a human silhouette from a certain angle. But the accounts from 1907 do not describe a vague resemblance. They describe structured features, orbital cavities with defined edges, curved bone-like surfaces with consistent proportions, a form that multiple observers, independently, described in similar structural terms. Pareidolia tends to produce subjective, variable responses. Two people looking at the same cloud formation will often describe entirely different shapes. But the 1907 accounts show a degree of consistency that sits awkwardly alongside the pareidolia explanation. If each observer was simply projecting a familiar pattern onto an ambiguous form, the descriptions should vary more than they do. The second issue is scale. Concretions form at many sizes, and large concretions are not unheard of. But a concretion of sufficient scale to be described as 30 feet in length, with bilateral symmetry and proportionate internal structure, falls well outside the normal range of documented concretion formations. The geological literature on concretions includes examples of impressive size, some reaching several meters, but the specific combination of scale, symmetry, and structural detail described in the 1907 accounts does not have a straightforward parallel in the documented record of natural mineral formations. That does not make it impossible, but it does mean the geological explanation requires the 1907 formation to be an unusually extreme example of a known process, at the very outer boundary of what that process is documented to produce. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because if the object was at the outer boundary of what natural processes can produce, it should have attracted significant scientific interest precisely because of that. An exceptionally large, unusually symmetrical, biologically resembling concretion would be notable in its own right. It would be worth documenting, preserving, and studying as an example of natural formation processes operating at unusual scale. The geological community of 1907 was active and well organized. There were journals, professional societies, and institutional channels for exactly this kind of documentation. A find of that character, even fully explained as a natural formation, should have generated some record within those channels. It did not. Or if it did, that record has not surfaced in any publicly accessible form. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Not because the science behind it is wrong. The science is sound. Pareidolia is real. Concretions are real. Geological misidentification is a genuine and recurring issue in field observation. All of that is true. The problem is not with the explanation itself. The problem is with how the explanation was applied. A proper application of the official framework would have produced documentation. It would have produced a formal assessment, a geological survey, a note in an institutional record somewhere confirming that what was found had been examined, identified as a natural formation, and disposed of accordingly. That is what scientific dismissal looks like when it is done correctly. It leaves a record of the dismissal. The 1907 case does not have that record. What it has is the initial accounts and then silence, not the silence of a case properly closed and filed. The silence of a case that stopped generating documentation at a very early stage, before the normal institutional processes had time to produce the secondary record that should accompany them. Some researchers argue this distinction matters more than it initially appears. A genuine geological misidentification, handled through normal channels, would have left traces. The absence of those traces suggests that whatever happened to the find, it did not follow the normal sequence of identification, assessment, and formal dismissal that the official explanation implies. Why reasonable in its core components cannot be fully verified against the actual record of what happened in 1907. The explanation says the workers were mistaken. It says the object was natural, the perception was distorted, and the scale was exaggerated. These are all plausible claims. But a claim is not a conclusion. A claim supported by sound general science but not by specific documentation of the actual case, leaves a gap between what the explanation proposes and what the record confirms. That gap is not evidence of anything in particular. It does not prove the official explanation is wrong, but it does mean that the explanation, however tidy it appears, is resting on an absence. It is telling us what probably happened without being able to show us the record of what actually did. And for a find that, by any measure, should have generated substantial documentation, the gap between what probably happened and what the record confirms is wider than it ought to be. The explanation arrived. It sounded reasonable. It settled the question for most people who encountered the case. But settling a question and answering it are not always the same thing. And when the documentation that should support the official answer is examined, or rather when the absence of that documentation is examined, the question that seemed settled starts to feel, on closer inspection, somewhat less resolved than it first appeared. The geological explanation is not unreasonable. That is worth saying clearly before anything else. It draws on real science. It references documented phenomena. It applies known cognitive and geological processes to an ambiguous historical account. If you encounter the 1907 case for the first time, and someone offers the concretion and pareidolia framework as an explanation, the immediate response of most reasonable people is to accept it. It sounds like exactly the kind of level-headed scientific correction that prevents ordinary misidentifications from becoming permanent myths. But accepting an explanation and examining it carefully are two different things. And when the geological explanation for the 1907 discovery is examined carefully, it requires something that is easy to overlook in the initial telling. It requires the workers to have been wrong, not partially wrong, not wrong about one or two details, wrong about almost everything they observed and reported. That is a significant requirement, and it deserves more scrutiny than it typically receives. Start with the most basic version of the argument. The workers were untrained. They were not archaeologists or geologists. They had no formal background in identifying natural formations or distinguishing biological structures from mineral ones. In poor lighting conditions, underground, surrounded by dust and debris, their perception of what they encountered would have been imperfect at best. These are fair and reasonable points. No honest examination of the case can dismiss them. The conditions in which the observation was made were genuinely not ideal for precise visual analysis, and the cognitive tendency to perceive familiar shapes in ambiguous material is real, well documented, and not limited to untrained observers. But here is where the explanation begins to require more than it initially appears to require. The 1907 excavation site was not a single worker making a single observation in isolation. Multiple workers were present during the uncovering of the find. That is established in the surviving accounts. When something unusual was encountered, supervisors were called to the site. Additional people came to look. And when the written accounts from that period are examined, at least two independent descriptions exist that characterize the find in consistent structural terms. That consistency is the first problem for the official explanation. Pareidolia, as a cognitive phenomenon, tends to produce variable results across different observers. When a group of people looks at an ambiguous visual stimulus, a cloud formation, a rock surface, a stain on a wall, they typically describe different things. One person sees a face. Another sees an animal. A third sees nothing recognizable at all. The perception is subjective, shaped by individual cognitive patterns, recent experiences, and the specific angle and lighting conditions each person encounters. That variability is actually one of the defining characteristics of pareidolia as a documented phenomenon. But the accounts from 1907 do not show that variability. They show agreement. Not agreement on every minor detail. The accounts do diverge in certain specifics, but agreement on the fundamental structural character of the find. Multiple observers, independently, described something with defined edges, something with curved surfaces, something with what appeared to be organized, proportionate, bone-like segments rather than the irregular, asymmetrical surface texture that characterizes natural mineral formations. That level of consistency across independent observers is difficult to explain purely through pareidolia. If each worker was simply projecting a familiar shape onto an ambiguous geological form, the descriptions should look more different from each other than they do. The fact that they converge on similar structural observations suggests that the object itself had structural features consistent enough to produce similar responses across multiple viewers. And that pushes the question back to the object. What kind of natural formation produces that degree of consistent structural impression across independent observers? This is where the concretion argument faces its own specific difficulties. Concretions are real. They form through documented geological processes. They can reach considerable size under the right conditions, and their surface texture can, in certain cases, produce a passing resemblance to biological material. All of that is accurate, but concretions have characteristic properties that distinguish them from biological structures, and those properties are relevant here. Natural concretions tend to be irregular. Their growth process, driven by the gradual precipitation of minerals around a central nucleus, does not follow a symmetrical pattern. The result is typically a rounded but uneven mass, with surface features that reflect the random distribution of mineral deposition rather than the organized geometry of biological anatomy. When concretions do produce rounded protrusions or cavity-like indentations, those features are generally distributed without the bilateral symmetry that characterizes vertebrate skull anatomy. And bilateral symmetry is precisely what the 1907 accounts describe. The orbital features, the cavities described as resembling eye sockets, were apparently positioned in a way that suggested proportion and balance. The curved surfaces were described as consistent across the structure rather than irregular or randomly distributed. These are not the characteristics of a typical concretion. They are the characteristics of something with organized, symmetrical structure. Whether that structure was biological in origin or the product of some other process, the description does not fit comfortably within the normal range of documented concretion behavior. At first, this seems like a detail that could be set aside. But there is a problem. The scale makes it harder to set aside. A concretion producing vague bilateral symmetry at a small size is already at the unusual end of documented natural formations. A concretion producing apparent bilateral symmetry, proportionate orbital spacing, and consistent curved surfaces at approximately 30 feet in length would be, by any geological standard, an extraordinary and unprecedented example of natural mineral formation. Extraordinary claims in science require extraordinary evidence, but the inverse is also true. Extraordinary natural formations require extraordinary documentation. They are scientifically significant in their own right, not because they resemble something biological, but because they demonstrate natural processes operating at an unusual extreme. If the 1907 object was a concretion of that scale and character, it should have been scientifically valuable as a geological specimen regardless of any biological resemblance. Geologists of that era were actively documenting unusual natural formations. Journals existed for exactly that purpose. Institutional collections were acquiring notable specimens. The find should have attracted geological interest, not just archaeological dismissal. It did not. Or if it did, that interest left no trace in any accessible record. This is where the explanation becomes difficult in a different way, because now the geological explanation is not just asking us to accept that the workers misidentified a natural formation. It is also asking us to accept that the natural formation itself, which would have been scientifically notable even as a geological specimen, was examined, identified, and then passed through the system without generating any documentation in the geological or scientific record of the period. That is two separate gaps in the record, not one. The first gap is the absence of any formal assessment confirming the geological identification. If officials and record keepers arrived after the workers and determined that what was found was a natural formation, that determination should exist somewhere in writing. It does not appear to. The people who came after the workers, the supervisors, the officials, whoever was responsible for making the formal assessment, did not leave behind a clear written account of what they examined or what conclusion they reached. That alone is unusual. Official assessments, even informal ones conducted under poor record-keeping conditions, typically produce some trace, a notation in a site log, a letter to a local government body, a brief mention in a subsequent newspaper report. The complete absence of any such trace is not impossible, but it is not the expected outcome of a routine official assessment either. However, The timeline does not fully match what a normal dismissal process would produce. The second gap deepens the first. If the object was geologically significant, large enough, unusual enough, symmetrical enough to be worth documenting as a natural formation, then the scientific community's silence is a separate and additional absence that requires its own explanation. Two institutions that should have responded, local official record-keeping and regional scientific documentation, both show the same outcome: nothing. When two independent documentation channels produce the same absence in response to the same event, the question of why becomes harder to answer with a single simple explanation. Some researchers have suggested that the answer lies in the specific institutional dynamics of that era. Scientific societies and geological publications in the early 1900s operated with significant gatekeeping. Unusual finds reported by untrained workers in rural areas were frequently not followed up on, not because they were suppressed, but because the professional infrastructure of the time did not take such reports seriously enough to investigate them formally. Under this view, the silence reflects institutional indifference rather than anything more deliberate. That explanation has merit. Institutional indifference to rural, non-expert reports was genuinely common in that period. It explains a great deal of the missing documentation that surrounds unusual finds from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is a real and historically documented phenomenon, but it sits awkwardly alongside one specific detail in the 1907 case. The accounts suggest that officials did arrive at the site, not scientists necessarily, but people in positions of authority who would have been capable of initiating a formal response if one was warranted. Their arrival is documented, however briefly. Their assessment is not. The institutional indifference explanation works well for cases where no official attention was paid at all. It is less satisfying in a case where official attention was demonstrably paid, but the record of what that attention produced is missing. And this is where the first doubt becomes something more than a minor historical puzzle. The geological explanation requires the workers to have been wrong about their core observations. It requires the object to have been a natural formation that happened to produce consistent structural impressions across multiple independent observers. It requires that natural formation to have been significant enough to merit official attention, but not significant enough to merit documentation in any scientific record. And it requires all of these things to be true simultaneously, without any surviving written confirmation that the assessment was made, the identification was reached, or the conclusion was recorded. Each individual requirement is not impossible. In isolation, any one of them could be satisfied by ordinary historical circumstance. Poor record-keeping, institutional indifference, the natural chaos of information management in an earlier era, but they do not exist in isolation. They exist together, in the same case, producing the same outcome at every stage where documentation should have appeared and did not. That pattern is what transforms a simple historical gap into something worth examining more carefully. The workers observed something. They described it consistently. Officials arrived. And then the record stops producing information in a way that fits the normal behavior of a case properly handled and closed. What the officials found when they arrived, what they decided, and what they did with their decision remains, more than a century later, genuinely unclear. Not because the answer is hidden, simply because the record that should contain it does not appear to exist, and a gap of that specific shape, in that specific location in the sequence of events, raises questions that the geological explanation, however scientifically sound in its general principles, has not fully answered. To understand why the 1907 discovery matters beyond the immediate details of the find itself, it helps to step back and look at what was already known about the region before that excavation began, because the 1907 case did not occur in a vacuum. It did not emerge from a location with no prior history of unusual finds. It occurred in an area that had already been producing reports of anomalous discoveries for several decades. And when those earlier reports are examined alongside the 1907 case, the picture that forms is not one of an isolated incident. It is something closer to a pattern. The region had a documented history of unusual excavation, finds stretching back at least to the 1880s. That documentation exists primarily in local newspapers, county records, and the personal notes of surveyors and landowners from the period. It is not the kind of documentation that makes its way into major academic archives or institutional collections. It is the kind that sits in bound newspaper volumes in regional libraries, in handwritten ledgers stored in county courthouses, in church records that have never been digitized or formally indexed, scattered, fragmented, and requiring significant effort to locate, but present. What those records show, across the 1880s and into the 1890s, is a series of reports describing bones found during ordinary ground-disturbing work, farming operations that turned up remains during plowing, road construction crews that encountered skeletal material during grading, foundation work for new buildings that broke into something unexpected several feet below grade. These were not formal archaeological excavations. They were practical projects carried out by working people who were not looking for anything unusual and who had no particular framework for interpreting what they found. The reports that appeared in local newspapers from this period share certain characteristics that are worth noting. They were brief. Most ran to a few sentences, occasionally a short paragraph. They described the find in basic terms, where it was found, what it appeared to be, and in some cases rough size estimates. And then, in almost every documented instance, the report ended with some version of the same statement. The bones or remains had been handed over to someone, an official, a representative of some kind, a person described in vague terms whose institutional affiliation was either not recorded or not considered important enough to specify. That handover point is where the documentation consistently stopped. There were rarely follow-up reports. The newspaper that ran the initial account did not, in most cases, return to the story a week or a month later to report on what had been determined about the find. There was no second article explaining that the bones had been examined and identified as animal remains, or that they had been determined to be from a known burial site, or that they had been returned to the ground. The story simply ended at the moment of transfer. The find was made, it was described, it was handed over, and it disappeared from the public record. This pattern of brief initial reporting, followed by complete silence, is, on its own, not necessarily unusual for that era. Rural newspapers in the 1880s and 1890s operated with limited staff and limited resources. Follow-up reporting on minor local incidents was inconsistent. Many stories that opened with an interesting observation simply never received a second entry because the practical demands of producing a weekly or biweekly paper left no room for sustained coverage of any single topic. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the pattern becomes harder to explain through editorial limitations alone when the frequency of the reports is taken into account. Unusual skeletal finds are, by their nature, rare events. A single town, in the course of a decade, might expect to encounter 1 or 2 reports of unexpected bone discoveries during construction or farming. These events are uncommon enough that when they do occur, they typically generate sustained local interest. People talk about them. The newspaper returns to the story because readers want to know what was found and what it means. Local officials make statements. The community engages with the discovery in an ongoing way. That is the normal behavior of an unusual find in a small community. It attracts attention precisely because unusual finds are unusual. But the reports from this region in the 1880s and 1890s do not behave that way. They appear with a frequency that suggests these were not isolated events separated by years. They appear across multiple communities in the same broader area, in the same general time period, with the same structural pattern. Find, brief report, handover, silence. If each of these cases was genuinely unremarkable, a misidentified rock, an animal bone, an ordinary burial from a known period, the frequency itself becomes the question. How many ordinary misidentifications can occur in the same region across the same decades before the frequency itself requires explanation? Some researchers who have studied this period argue that the frequency is exactly what makes this regional history significant. Not any single report, but the accumulation of reports, all following the same pattern, all ending at the same point in the sequence. They suggest that what the regional record reflects is not a series of unrelated incidents, but a systematic pattern of discovery and removal that was operating across a wide area during this specific historical window. Others disagree. They point to the general unreliability of rural newspaper reporting in this era. Sensational or unusual reports were sometimes exaggerated or even fabricated to fill column space. Size estimates provided by untrained observers are notoriously inaccurate, and the handover to unnamed officials was often simply the standard local practice of reporting unusual finds to the nearest authority figure, with no deeper significance than civic habit. Both positions are defensible with the available evidence, and that ambiguity is itself part of what makes the regional background significant. The record is not clear enough to confirm either interpretation definitively. What it is clear enough to establish is that the region was producing these reports with a frequency and a consistency that sits uncomfortably alongside the explanation that each case was simply an ordinary misidentification handled in the ordinary way. At first, it seems normal, but there is a problem. The problem becomes more specific when the county records and surveyor notes from the same period are examined alongside the newspaper accounts. Local surveyors working in the region during the 1880s and 1890s occasionally noted unusual subsurface findings in their field records. These notes were professional documents, not newspaper stories. They were produced by trained observers working under formal professional obligations, and several of them reference bone material encountered during survey work in terms that suggest the observers themselves were uncertain about what they had found. Surveyor field notes are not given to exaggeration. They are functional documents designed to record measurements, terrain features, and significant subsurface observations in precise, practical language. When a surveyor notes that unusual material was encountered and transferred to an unspecified party, that notation reflects a deliberate professional judgment that the material warranted reporting and removal. It is not the language of someone dismissing a misidentified rock. It is the language of someone who encountered something they considered significant enough to flag and pass up the chain. Several of these notations from the regional surveyor records of the 1880s and 1890s share the same characteristic that defines the newspaper accounts. They record the discovery and the transfer. They do not record what happened after the transfer. The receiving party is described in general terms. The final disposition of the material is not documented. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because what the convergence of newspaper accounts, county records, and surveyor notes from this region and period suggests is not simply that unusual finds were being made. It suggests that there was an operational response to those finds that was consistent across different types of observers, different documentation contexts, and different locations within the same broader area. The workers who reported to newspapers, the landowners who notified local officials, and the professional surveyors who made field notations all ended up at the same point. The material was handed over and the record stopped. Consistent outcomes across independent channels usually reflect a consistent system operating behind them. That system did not announce itself. It left no documentation of its own existence in the records that have been examined, but its presence can be inferred from the regularity of the outcome it produced. This brings in a piece of context that becomes increasingly relevant as the regional picture is assembled. By the 1870s and 1880s, institutional infrastructure for the collection and centralization of unusual archaeological and anthropological material was actively developing in the United States. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology was established in 1879 with an explicit mandate to collect and study material related to the human history of the North American continent. Field agents connected to this and similar institutional networks were operating across the country during exactly the period when the regional newspaper reports and surveyor notations were accumulating. These agents were not always highly visible in the communities they worked in. They operated through correspondence networks, through relationships with local officials and newspaper editors, and through informal arrangements that allowed material to move from local sites to institutional collections without extensive public documentation. This is documented institutional history. The acquisition records of major collections from this period show material arriving from regional sources with varying degrees of documentation about its origins and the circumstances of its transfer. However, the timeline does not fully match a simple picture of routine institutional collection. Routine collection would have produced at least some documentation at the receiving end, even when the originating records were sparse. Institutions that were actively acquiring material kept records of what they received, where it came from, and what assessment was made of it. Those receiving records exist for many categories of material from this period, but for the specific type of finds described in the regional newspaper accounts and surveyor notes, the oversized bones, the unusual skeletal material, the finds described as anomalous by the people who encountered them, the receiving documentation is as sparse as the originating documentation. Both ends of the transfer are quiet. The finding is reported briefly and then not followed up. The receiving institution, if there was one, did not generate accessible records of what arrived. The material moved through the system and left almost no trace at either end of its journey. What this means for understanding the 1907 case is not a conclusion. It is a context. The discovery that workers made in that year did not occur in a region with no prior history of similar events. It occurred in a region where the same pattern had been playing out for at least 2 decades. Find, report, transfer, silence. The 1907 case was not the beginning of that pattern. It was, based on the available regional record, a continuation of it. And that changes the question slightly. The question is no longer simply what was found in 1907 and what happened to it. The question becomes what kind of system was already in place by 1907 that could receive a find of that nature and process it in a way that left the same absence in the record that dozens of smaller finds had left in the decades before it. That system was not invented in response to the 1907 discovery. It was already operating. The 1907 case entered a mechanism that had been running for years, and understanding that mechanism, or at least understanding the shape of what it produced, is what makes the regional background more than historical background. It is what makes it relevant to what happened next. When researchers attempt to trace a historical discovery through the official record, there is a general expectation of what they will find, not necessarily complete documentation, not a perfectly preserved chain of custody from the moment of discovery to the present day. Historical records are imperfect. Files are lost. Archives are incomplete. Documentation practices in the early 20th century were inconsistent, and the further back you go, the more gaps appear in even the most carefully maintained institutional records. That is understood. That is accepted as a basic condition of historical research. But there is a difference between incomplete records and absent records. Incomplete records leave fragments. They leave partial files, reference documents that no longer exist in their original form, notations that point toward information even when that information itself is missing. Absent records leave nothing. No fragment, no reference, no notation pointing toward a document that should exist. Just a space where the information should be and is not. When the 1907 discovery is traced through the official record, what researchers encounter is closer to the second category than the first, and that distinction matters more than it might initially appear. The physical object itself is not documented in any publicly accessible institutional archive. That sentence is straightforward, but the implications of it are worth unpacking carefully. A structure described as approximately 30 feet in length, pulled from beneath a functioning town during an active excavation project, is not a small or easily managed object. It is not the kind of find that can be wrapped in cloth, placed in a crate, and quietly moved by 1 or 2 people between tasks. An object of that scale requires planning. It requires equipment. It requires personnel. It requires coordination between whoever is managing the excavation and whoever is responsible for receiving and storing what the excavation produces. All of that coordination generates documentation. Not always formal documentation, but documentation of some kind. Work orders, transport arrangements, correspondence between the site supervisor and whoever authorized the removal. A receiving notation from the institution or facility that took custody of the object. A storage record indicating where it was placed and under what reference number. These are the practical traces that large-scale logistics leave behind, not because anyone is trying to create a historical record, but because moving large objects requires organizational effort, and organizational effort requires communication. None of that documentation has been located for the 1907 find. This is worth pausing on, because the absence is specific. It is not the case that documentation exists but is difficult to access. It is not the case that records are held in a restricted archive that researchers have been unable to obtain permission to examine. The absence is in the publicly accessible record. Institutions that hold historical documentation from this period and region have been consulted. The documentation that should reflect the post-discovery handling of the find does not appear in what those institutions have made available. There are two scenarios that should have produced a record, and neither has. The first scenario is that the object was examined by officials or scientists, determined to be a natural geological formation, and dismissed. That is the official explanation. If that explanation is accurate, it should have left a dismissal record, a formal or informal written assessment, concluding that the find was a misidentified concretion, a notation from whatever authority made that determination, a brief correspondence between local officials and a scientific body, confirming that the matter had been reviewed and closed. Dismissals are documented when an official investigation or assessment concludes that something is not what it appeared to be. The conclusion is typically recorded precisely because recording it closes the case and prevents the question from being reopened unnecessarily. No such dismissal record has been found. The second scenario is that the object was identified as significant and preserved. If the find was considered important enough to transfer to an institutional collection, that transfer should have generated a receiving record at the destination. Collections that actively acquired material during the early 20th century maintained acquisition logs. Items were cataloged upon arrival, assigned reference numbers, and entered into the institutional record in a way that allowed them to be located and retrieved later. That is the basic function of an institutional collection. Without those records, the collection cannot operate as a collection. It becomes a warehouse of unidentifiable material rather than the curated archive. No receiving record for an object matching the description of the 1907 find has been located in any institutional collection that has been examined. Both ends of the documentation chain are missing simultaneously, and that is where the absence stops looking like ordinary historical incompleteness and starts looking like something that requires a more specific explanation. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the absence is not limited to the physical object itself. It extends to the surrounding documentation that any significant excavation find would have generated even before the question of what to do with the object was resolved. The newspapers that initially covered the discovery did not return to the story. In an era when local newspapers were the primary source of community information and when unusual local events were considered highly newsworthy, the silence of the follow-up coverage is notable. A 30-foot structure found beneath a town street is exactly the kind of story that sells papers. It is the kind of story that readers ask about. It is the kind of story that a local editor would have reason to return to simply because public interest would have demanded it. The follow-up coverage does not exist. Not a brief update. Not a letter to the editor speculating about what was found. Not a mention in a subsequent issue referencing the earlier report. The story appeared and then, from the newspaper record's perspective, stopped existing. The local government records from the same period present a similar picture. The excavation project itself appears in these records in general terms. There are references to the work being conducted, to the permits or authorizations that governed it, to the general scope of what was being dug. But the specific discovery, the find that the workers reported and that prompted officials to visit the site, does not appear in the local government documentation in any specific way. The excavation is recorded. The discovery within the excavation is not. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Local government records from active excavation projects in this period typically reflect significant finds, even informally. A foreman's report, a note to a supervising official, a brief entry in a municipal log indicating that something unusual had been encountered and that appropriate parties had been notified. These are not formal scientific documents. They are the practical administrative traces of a project encountering something outside the expected scope of the work. They exist because someone in the chain of responsibility needed to inform someone else that the situation had changed. In the 1907 case, that administrative trace is absent from what has been examined. The project continued to be documented in general terms after the reported date of the discovery, but the discovery itself does not appear to have generated the kind of administrative notation that would normally accompany an unexpected find of significant scale. The workers who were present at the time of the discovery present a related problem. In one surviving account, several workers are identified by first name only. No surnames. No employment records connecting those first names to specific individuals. No subsequent statements from any of the workers describing what they saw, what was done, or what they were told about the find after officials arrived. Workers who witness unusual events during excavation projects often become local sources of information about those events. They talk. They describe what they saw to family members, neighbors, and anyone who asks. Those conversations sometimes make their way into written form, into letters, into diary entries, into recorded oral histories collected years later. None of that secondary witness documentation has surfaced for the 1907 case. At first, it seems normal, but there is a problem. The problem is the cumulative weight of these absences. Each individual absence has a plausible ordinary explanation. Newspapers miss follow-up stories. Local government records have gaps. Workers are identified incompletely in historical accounts. These things happen. They are the normal texture of historical incompleteness. But when they occur together in the same case, at every point where documentation should appear and does not, the cumulative picture becomes harder to explain through ordinary historical chance. Every significant find has what might be called a second story. The first story is the discovery itself. What was found, where it was found, who found it, what it looked like. The second story is everything that happened afterward. Who was called, what assessment was made, what decision was reached, where the object went, who authorized the transfer, what the receiving party recorded, how the case was officially closed or officially opened for further investigation. These two stories are not separable. The second story is the part that gives the first story meaning. Without it, the discovery is just an event that happened and then stopped happening, with no consequence and no continuation. In the 1907 case, the second story is almost entirely missing. What exists is the beginning of the first story. Workers found something. It was described. Officials were notified. And then the narrative thread that should carry the case forward into documentation, assessment, and resolution simply stops producing information. However, the timeline does not fully match the behavior of a case that was properly handled and concluded. A properly handled case, even a simple one, even a quickly resolved one, generates a closing record of some kind. The absence of a closing record is not the same as a closed case. It is an open case with no visible continuation, and an open case with no visible continuation, in the context of a find that multiple observers described in consistent and specific structural terms, is not the same as a resolved question. Some researchers who have examined the documentation gaps in cases like this one suggest that the absence itself is the most significant piece of information the record contains, not because absence proves anything specific, but because the particular shape of the absence, what is missing, where it is missing, and at what point in the expected documentation sequence the record goes quiet, tells you something about how the find was handled even when it does not tell you what the find actually was. The shape of this absence is specific. It is not random incompleteness distributed across the record in the way that ordinary historical deterioration produces. It is concentrated at the points of transition, the moment when the worker's observation became an official matter, the moment when the official matter should have produced an assessment, the moment when the assessment should have produced a decision, the moment when the decision should have produced a transfer or a dismissal record. At each of those transition points, the documentation stops. That pattern, silence at every point of institutional transition, is what distinguishes this case from ordinary historical incompleteness. And it is what makes the missing second story more than a simple archival gap. It raises a question that the available record is not equipped to answer. Not what was found in 1907, but what happened to it in the hours and days after it was found, and why the system that should have recorded those events left behind almost nothing to show that it had operated at all. By the early 1900s, the institutional landscape for managing unusual archaeological discoveries in the United States was not a loose or informal arrangement. It was a structured system with established channels, active field personnel, and a well-developed correspondence network that connected remote locations to centralized bodies in ways that were not always visible to the general public, but were functionally efficient. Understanding that system is essential to understanding why one specific detail in the 1907 case raises a question that the available record has never satisfactorily answered. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology had been in operation since 1879. That is nearly 3 decades of active institutional presence by the time the 1907 excavation took place. The Bureau was not a passive repository. It was an actively acquisitive body with a defined mandate. That mandate included the collection, documentation, and centralized study of archaeological and anthropological material from across the United States. It was funded by Congress. It employed professional staff, and it operated through a network of field agents and regional correspondents who were positioned across the country specifically to identify, report, and facilitate the transfer of significant finds to institutional custody. This is not a speculative characterization of how the Bureau operated. It is documented institutional history. The Bureau's own collection records from this period show thousands of items acquired through exactly the kind of regional correspondent network that was in place by 1907. Letters in the Smithsonian's archive describe field agents receiving word of unusual finds through local contacts, newspaper editors, county officials, land surveyors, clergymen, and responding by traveling to the site, assessing the material, and arranging for its transfer to Washington or to affiliated institutional collections. The system was real, it was active, and it was operating in the precise geographic and temporal window that surrounds the 1907 discovery. Understanding this context does not immediately explain what happened in 1907, but it does establish something important. By that year, there was already an institutional infrastructure capable of receiving a report about an unusual find, dispatching a representative, and managing the transfer of material in a way that did not necessarily generate extensive public documentation. That capability existed. It was being used routinely, and the 1907 case occurred within the operational range of that system. What makes this context shift from background information to something more directly relevant is a specific detail that appears in one of the surviving accounts of the 1907 discovery. It is a small detail. It occupies only a few lines in the account where it appears, but it is the kind of detail that, once noticed, is difficult to set aside without a satisfactory explanation. According to that account, a representative described as being from an Eastern scientific institution arrived at the excavation site within days of the initial discovery. Not weeks, days. The account does not specify the exact number of days, but the phrasing makes clear that the arrival was rapid. It happened while the discovery was still fresh, before the local situation had fully stabilized, and before the story had spread through any publication network that could have carried the news to a distant institution. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The representative's name is not recorded in the account. His institution is identified only by the vague descriptor Eastern Scientific Institution, a phrase that in the context of 1907 could point towards several bodies, but does not conclusively identify any of them. His credentials are not described. His purpose in coming is not explained beyond the general implication that he was there to assess the find, and his findings, whatever they were never published in any journal or institutional report that researchers have been able to locate. His presence is mentioned once, in a single surviving account, and it is never referenced again in any other document from the period. That combination of factors is what makes this detail significant rather than merely curious. It is not unusual for institutional representatives to visit excavation sites. That was part of how the collection system operated. What is unusual is the speed of the arrival, the absence of identification, the lack of any published findings, and the complete disappearance of any further reference to the visit in the documentary record. But this is where it becomes unclear. Consider the logistical reality of 1907. Communication between a remote excavation site and a distant Eastern institution depended on telegraph or postal correspondence. Travel from an Eastern city to a rural excavation site required rail transport, followed by local conveyance. A journey that in 1907 could take anywhere from 1 to several days, depending on the specific locations involved. For a representative to arrive at the site within days of the initial discovery, the process of notification, authorization, and travel would have had to begin almost immediately after the find was made. That timeline raises a straightforward logistical question. How did the representative know to come? The story had not yet appeared in any national publication. The local newspaper coverage, based on the surviving accounts, was limited and did not circulate beyond the immediate region in a form that would have reached an Eastern institution quickly enough to prompt a response within the observed time frame. The workers who made the discovery were identified only by first name in the surviving accounts, which suggests they were not connected to any institutional network that would have provided a direct channel for reporting the find upward. Some believe the answer lies in the local correspondent network. Under this explanation, a local official or newspaper editor with an existing relationship with an institutional representative sent word through an established channel almost immediately after the discovery was reported. The correspondent network was designed for exactly this purpose. It allowed institutional bodies to receive rapid notification of significant finds through trusted regional contacts who understood what kinds of material were worth reporting and who to report them to. That explanation is plausible. It is consistent with how the Bureau and similar institutions operated during this period. If a local contact with an institutional connection was aware of the find within hours of it being made and sent word through an existing correspondence channel, a representative could theoretically have been dispatched quickly enough to arrive within the observed time frame. But this explanation, while plausible, introduces its own questions. If a local correspondent reported the find through an institutional channel, that report should exist somewhere in the institutional correspondence record. Letters sent through the Bureau's regional network were typically filed and preserved. The Bureau maintained correspondence archives that researchers have accessed. A letter from a regional correspondent reporting a significant unusual find at a specific location and date should be traceable, at least in principle, if it was sent through the official network. No such letter has been identified in the accessible correspondence records from this period and region, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult. The absence of the correspondent letter does not prove the explanation is wrong. Correspondence archives from this era are incomplete. Letters were lost, misfiled, or simply not preserved if they were considered routine. The absence of a specific letter is not the same as proof that the letter was never written. These are honest qualifications that any responsible examination of the evidence has to acknowledge. But the absent letter is not the only missing piece. It sits alongside the absent name of the representative, the absent identification of his institution, the absent record of his findings, and the absent follow-up coverage in the local newspaper. All of these absences cluster around the same moment in the case's timeline, the moment when an outside institutional presence entered the situation. And the clustering of absences at exactly that point is what makes the logistical question about the representative's arrival more than a minor historical puzzle. When an institutional representative visits a site, the visit generates traces. The representative travels, which involves arrangements that leave records. The representative communicates with whoever sent him, which produces correspondence. The representative produces some kind of assessment or report, which gets filed somewhere. And the representative's visit is noticed by people at the site, who mention it in subsequent accounts and conversations. These are the natural byproducts of an institutional site visit in 1907. In this case, the visit is mentioned once and then leaves no further trace of any kind. However, the timeline does not fully match the behavior of a routine institutional assessment visit. Routine visits, even brief ones, even ones that concluded quickly with the simple determination, generated at least minimal documentation within the institutional system that sent the representative. An expense record for travel, a brief report filed upon return, a notation in the representative's professional correspondence indicating that the visit had occurred and what had been found. These are not elaborate documents. They are the minimal administrative residue of professional activity. None of that residue has been found in any archive that has been examined in connection with this case. Some researchers who have studied the institutional practices of this period suggest that the absence is actually consistent with the specific operational mode that some institutions used for sensitive or ambiguous finds. Under this mode, a representative would conduct a preliminary assessment under informal authorization, without generating official institutional documentation, specifically to allow the institution to evaluate the material before deciding whether to formally engage with it. If the assessment concluded that the material was not significant, the visit would simply not be recorded in the official institutional record. No report would be filed because no official assessment had been initiated. Others disagree with this interpretation. They argue that even informal preliminary visits left some trace in the personal correspondence or expense records of individuals involved, and that the complete absence of any such trace suggests either that the representative was not operating through any institutional channel that has been examined, or that the account of his presence is not reliable as a historical record. Both positions are defensible. Neither can be confirmed with the available evidence. What remains is the detail itself. A person arrived at the site. He came from somewhere. He came quickly. He looked at what had been found. And then he left, and the record of his presence consists of a single mention in a single surviving account, with no name, no institution, no findings, and no follow-up of any kind. The system that was in place by 1907 was capable of receiving information about unusual finds and responding to them rapidly through established channels. That capability is documented. That the 1907 find received a rapid response from someone connected to an Eastern scientific institution is also, based on the surviving account, documented. What is not documented is how the response was initiated, who initiated it, what the responding representative determined, and what happened as a result of his visit. That gap sits at the center of the 1907 case. Everything before it, the discovery, the workers' accounts, the initial newspaper coverage, is reasonably well established. Everything after it, the fate of the object, the official assessment, the institutional response, is absent from the record, and the representative whose arrival marks the boundary between what is documented and what is not remains, more than a century later, an unnamed figure in a single account, present at the exact moment when the case stopped generating information and never mentioned again. How did he know to come? The record does not say, and the record's silence on that specific question is, in the context of everything else that is missing from this case, exactly where the deeper questions about the 1907 discovery begin. The 1907 case is easier to set aside if it stands alone. A single unusual discovery with incomplete documentation and a missing paper trail can be absorbed into the general noise of historical incompleteness. Records are lost. Accounts are unreliable. Small towns in the early 20th century did not maintain the kind of systematic archival infrastructure that would allow every unusual event to be traced cleanly from beginning to end. A single case with these characteristics is, on its own, a historical curiosity. Interesting, perhaps worth noting, but not necessarily significant beyond its own specific details. But the 1907 case does not stand alone, and that is what changes the nature of the question. When the broader historical record of the late 19th and early 20th centuries is examined with specific attention to reports of unusually large skeletal remains, a pattern emerges that is difficult to ignore once it has been identified. The pattern is not complicated. It does not require elaborate interpretation to recognize. It is simply the repeated appearance of the same sequence of events across different locations, different decades, and different documentation contexts, all producing the same outcome. The find is made. Local coverage occurs. An outside representative or official arrives. The physical material is transferred, and then the documentation trail narrows, or ends entirely. That sequence appears not once or twice, but across a significant number of cases from the same general era. And the consistency of the sequence is what transforms it from a collection of individual historical accidents into something that requires a more systematic explanation. Before going further, it is worth being precise about what this pattern does and does not represent. It is not a claim that every case in this sequence involved deliberate suppression of information. It is not an argument that a coordinated effort was made to conceal the existence of unusual skeletal material from the public. Those are interpretations, and they go beyond what the pattern itself demonstrates. What the pattern demonstrates is simpler and more verifiable. It is an observation about how the information behaves across a significant number of cases involving the same category of find. The information behaves in the same way. It appears briefly, it reaches a transfer point, and it stops. That behavioral consistency is what makes the pattern worth examining carefully. The 1883 Ohio case provides one of the clearer examples. A county surveyor working in a rural area of Ohio documented a discovery of large-scale bone material in his personal records. Surveyors were professional observers. They recorded what they saw in practical, precise terms as a matter of professional habit. This surveyor's notes describe bone material that he characterized as unusually large, found during survey work in an area with no prior documented burial sites of the relevant period. He recorded the dimensions as he estimated them. He recorded the location, and he recorded what happened next. The bones were transferred to what he described in his notes as state custody. That phrase is specific enough to suggest that the transfer was not informal. State custody implies an official receiving body, an authorized representative, a formal handover of some kind. It implies documentation on the receiving end. A state body that takes custody of archaeological material maintains records of what it receives. That is the basic administrative requirement of custodial responsibility. The surveyor followed up. His notes record that he sent inquiries to the relevant state body asking for information about what had been determined about the material he had reported. His follow-up inquiries received no response. Not a delayed response. Not an incomplete response. No response at all. The state body that had taken custody of the material did not acknowledge his inquiries in any form that he recorded, and no response from that body has surfaced in any archive connected to this case. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. A professional who formally transfers material to a state body and then sends follow-up inquiries about that material is not making an unreasonable request. He is doing exactly what a responsible professional should do. The absence of any response to those inquiries is not the behavior of a body that received ordinary material and processed it in an ordinary way. Ordinary material generates ordinary responses to ordinary inquiries. The complete absence of response suggests either that the inquiries never reached the relevant body, that the relevant body chose not to respond, or that the material itself had moved through the system in a way that made a standard response difficult or inappropriate to provide. None of those possibilities is reassuring from a documentation standpoint. All of them suggest that whatever happened to the 1883 Ohio material, it did not follow the normal processing path that state custody implies. The 1891 Midwest case presents a different but related problem. A report describing bones with unusual proportions found during excavation work appeared in a small academic journal. The appearance of an academic note is significant because it represents a higher level of institutional engagement than the newspaper report. Someone with enough academic standing or connection to submit a note to a journal had become aware of the find and considered it worth bringing to the attention of the scientific community. That is a more formal act than a local newspaper report. It implies a degree of institutional interest and a decision that the find merited professional attention. But this is where it becomes unclear. The academic note appeared once. No further study based on its contents was published in any journal that researchers have been able to identify. The original note was not indexed in the major scientific catalogs of the period. Scientific journals of the era maintained indexing systems specifically to allow researchers to locate and reference published work. A note that appeared in a journal but was not indexed in the standard catalogs is effectively invisible to the research community that the indexing system was designed to serve. It exists in the technical sense that it appeared in print, but it exists in a form that was functionally inaccessible to any researcher who did not already know exactly where to look for it. That is an unusual outcome for an academic publication, however brief. The indexing of journal content was not a perfect system in 1891. Small journals with limited circulation were sometimes incompletely indexed. These are acknowledged limitations of the scientific publishing infrastructure of that period. But the combination of a single appearance, no subsequent study, and absence from the major indexes produces the same functional outcome as the Ohio case. The information appeared briefly, and then became effectively inaccessible. At first, it seems normal, but there is a problem. The problem is not any individual case. Each individual case, examined in isolation, has available explanations that are consistent with ordinary historical circumstance. Incomplete records, inconsistent transfer documentation, regional journalism that rarely sustained national stories, academic publishing systems that were imperfect and incomplete. These are real features of the historical landscape of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They explain a great deal of missing documentation from this period across many different categories of information. But they are explanations for random incompleteness. They account for why some records are missing from some cases. They do not account for why the same specific type of record is missing from the same specific point in the sequence across a significant number of cases involving the same category of find. Random incompleteness produces random gaps. It produces cases where the initial report is missing, but the transfer record exists. Cases where the transfer record is missing, but the institutional assessment is preserved. Cases where individual documents within the sequence are lost while others survive. The gaps are distributed unevenly because the causes of incompleteness, fire, flood, administrative oversight, misfiling, deterioration, operate unevenly across different documents and different archives. The pattern in these cases does not look like random incompleteness. The gaps are not distributed unevenly. They cluster at the same point in the sequence, consistently, across cases separated by years and geography. The initial report exists. The transfer point is reached, and then the documentation ends. Not selectively, not partially, but at the same structural moment in case after case. However, the timeline does not fully match what random historical deterioration would be expected to produce. If the gaps were random, you would expect at least some cases in this category to have survived with complete documentation. You would expect the transfer records to exist in some cases. You would expect at least one institutional assessment from this period to have surfaced, confirming what was found, how it was identified, and where it went. The law of averages, applied to the genuine incompleteness of historical record-keeping, would predict that some portion of these cases would have left enough of a documentary trail to allow the sequence to be traced from discovery to final disposition. That has not happened. Researchers who have specifically examined this category of find from this period consistently report the same experience. The initial documentation exists or partially exists. The post-transfer documentation does not. Across case after case, the record stops at the same point. Some researchers argue that this consistency reflects the operation of a deliberate system. They suggest that the institutions responsible for receiving this material had a consistent practice of not generating, or not retaining, documentation about specific categories of finds. Under this view, the pattern is the product of institutional policy rather than institutional accident, and the consistency of the gaps reflects the consistency of the policy that produced them. Others disagree. They argue that the apparent pattern is a product of research bias. Researchers looking specifically for cases involving large, unusual skeletal finds will naturally focus on the cases where the initial report exists and the follow-up documentation is missing. Cases where the full documentation exists and the material was found to be ordinary would not appear in the research because they would not be identified as relevant. Under this view, the pattern is real but its meaning is limited. It reflects the selection criteria of the research rather than a genuine systemic feature of how this category of material was handled. Both arguments have merit. Neither can be resolved with the available evidence, and that irresolvability is itself a feature of the pattern. The evidence that would allow the competing explanations to be evaluated, the complete transfer records, the institutional assessments, the correspondence between regional contacts and central bodies, is exactly the evidence that is missing from the cases under examination. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this. Across the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a significant number of reports involving unusually large skeletal finds followed the same sequence. Find, report, transfer, silence. That sequence repeated across different states, different documentation contexts, and different decades. The individual explanations for each case's missing documentation are available and often plausible, but the collective consistency of the outcome across so many independent cases is not fully explained by the sum of those individual explanations. Patterns in historical data are not self-interpreting. They do not come with labels identifying their cause. A consistent outcome can reflect a consistent system, a consistent bias in the research, a consistent feature of the historical environment, or some combination of all three. Identifying the pattern is not the same as explaining it, but the pattern exists, and the 1907 case sits within it, not as an isolated anomaly, but as one instance in a sequence that had been repeating for decades before that excavation began and would continue repeating after it ended. That context does not explain what was found in 1907. It does not explain where it went or what the unnamed representative from the Eastern Scientific Institution determined when he examined it. What it does is make the 1907 case harder to dismiss as an ordinary historical accident, because ordinary historical accidents do not repeat themselves with this degree of structural consistency across this many independent cases over this many years. And when a pattern repeats that reliably, the question of what produces it becomes more pressing than the question of what any single instance within it actually contained. At a certain point in any investigation, the scope of the question changes. It begins with a specific case, a specific find, a specific set of missing records, and then the evidence accumulates to a point where the specific case can no longer contain the question it has generated. The question outgrows the case that produced it and becomes something larger, something that requires a different level of examination. That is where this investigation has arrived. The question is no longer about one skull in one town in 1907. It stopped being about that some time ago, because the 1907 case, examined in isolation, could theoretically be explained through the ordinary limitations of early 20th century record-keeping: incomplete documentation, inconsistent transfer practices, a small town without the archival infrastructure to preserve the full sequence of events surrounding an unusual find. These explanations are imperfect, but they are available. They provide enough cover for a single case to be set aside without demanding a deeper explanation. But the 1907 case is not in isolation. It exists within a broader pattern that has already been established. And when that broader pattern is examined as a whole rather than as a collection of individual cases, the ordinary explanations begin to fail in a specific and identifiable way. The failure is statistical in nature, and it is worth explaining carefully, because it is the core of why the question has expanded beyond any single case. If the documentation failures across these cases were genuinely random, they would be distributed randomly. That is what random means. Some cases would be well documented. Others would be poorly documented. The quality and completeness of the surviving record would vary in ways that reflect the genuine variability of archival conditions across different locations, different institutions, and different decades. You would expect to find, within the body of cases involving large, unusual skeletal finds from this period, at least a meaningful percentage where the full documentation chain had survived. Cases with complete transfer records, cases with confirmed receiving institution notations, cases with published analyses or institutional assessments that could be located and examined. Those cases would exist if the documentation failures were random. They do not appear to exist. Researchers who have spent years specifically tracing large skeletal finds from the late 19th and early 20th centuries consistently report the same experience. Not similar experiences. The same experience. The initial discovery is documentable. Local sources, newspapers, county records, surveyor notes, personal correspondence confirm that something was found. The find is described. The transfer point is reached. And then the record structure changes. Not deteriorates in the normal way that records deteriorate over time, with some documents surviving and others lost. Changes. The type of documentation that exists before the transfer point is simply not present after it. Files that should exist in institutional archives do not. Institutions that should have received material and recorded its arrival have no record of receiving anything matching the relevant description. Follow-up correspondence between the finder and the receiving body is absent from both ends of the exchange. This is where it becomes unclear, because the consistency of that research experience across independent researchers examining independent cases from independent geographic locations and time periods is not what random documentation failure looks like. Random failure produces variable outcomes. It produces some researchers finding complete records in some cases and missing records in others. The consistency of the outcome, the same truncation at the same point in the sequence, is the fingerprint of something that is not random. That does not immediately answer the question of what it is. Consistency can reflect many things. It can reflect a consistent flaw in the research methodology being applied. It can reflect a consistent feature of the historical environment that affected all cases of this type in similar ways. It can reflect a consistent institutional practice, or it can reflect something more deliberate. The consistency itself does not identify its own cause, but it does establish that the cause, whatever it is, was itself consistent. And consistency in any system is the product of design rather than accident. But this is where it becomes unclear in a different and more significant way, because the pattern does not stay within the boundaries of skeletal finds. When the scope of the examination is widened to include other categories of unusual material from the same era, the same pattern appears in a different domain. Cases involving unusual artifact discoveries from the late 19th and early 20th centuries show a structurally similar sequence. An artifact of unusual character is found during excavation or ground-disturbing work. It is reported in local sources. It attracts enough attention to generate at least initial documentation of its existence and general character. And then it is transferred to an institutional body, and the accessible public record of its existence effectively ends. No published analysis. No institutional catalog entry that researchers can locate. No follow-up documentation confirming what the artifact was determined to be or where it was ultimately stored. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The extension of the pattern into artifact cases is significant for a specific reason. It means the documentation failure is not specific to skeletal material. It is not a product of the particular sensitivities surrounding human remains, which might create institutional incentives to minimize public documentation. It appears across a broader category of unusual finds, and that broader application suggests the mechanism producing the pattern was not designed specifically around one type of material. It was operating at a level general enough to produce the same outcome across different categories of unusual archaeological finds. A mechanism general enough to operate across categories is a more fundamental type of mechanism than one designed for a specific purpose. It suggests something built into the basic infrastructure of how unusual material was received, processed, and recorded, rather than a specific policy targeting a specific type of find. At first, this seems like a fine distinction, but there is a problem with setting it aside, because if the mechanism was built into the basic infrastructure of the receiving system, then the absence of documentation is not incidental to the process. It is a feature of it. The system processed material in a way that consistently did not generate, or did not retain, accessible public documentation of what it received and what it determined. Whether that feature was intentional or was a structural byproduct of how the system operated is a separate question. But the feature itself, the consistent production of inaccessible or absent post-transfer records, appears to be a characteristic of the system rather than a failure of it. That is a significant reframing. It shifts the question from why the records are missing to what kind of system consistently produces missing records as its normal output. Some researchers who have examined this question suggest the answer lies in the institutional culture of the period. Scientific and governmental bodies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries operated with significant autonomy and minimal public accountability. They were not subject to the kind of transparency requirements that modern institutions operate under. They collected what they considered significant, stored it according to their own internal systems, and made available to the public only what they chose to make available. Under this framework, the absence of accessible public documentation is simply the natural output of institutions that were never designed to be publicly transparent in the first place. Others argue that this explanation, while historically accurate in general terms, does not fully account for the specific pattern. Institutions that were generally non-transparent still generated internal documentation. They kept their own records, even when those records were not publicly accessible. The absence of accessible public documentation is expected under this framework, but the absence of any internal institutional record that researchers have been able to locate, even through archival access to institutional collections from this period, goes beyond what general institutional opacity would predict. Internal records were kept for internal purposes. Their absence from institutional archives that have been at least partially open to researchers suggests either that the records were not created, or that they were removed from the institutional archive at some point after their creation. However, the timeline does not fully match a straightforward explanation of either institutional opacity or ordinary record loss. Institutional opacity would predict missing public records, but surviving internal ones. Ordinary record loss would predict variable survival, with some internal records present and others absent. What the research consistently encounters is a more complete absence than either of those models would predict. And a more complete absence than the available models predict is a signal that the available models may not be fully capturing what actually happened. This does not resolve into a simple conclusion. The evidence does not point cleanly toward any single explanation for why the pattern exists and what produced it. What it does is establish, with reasonable confidence, that the pattern is real, that it extends beyond a single category of find, and that it is more consistent than random historical deterioration would be expected to produce. When a process consistently produces the same outcome across different inputs, different locations, and different time periods, the consistency is informative regardless of whether the cause has been identified. It tells you that the cause is itself consistent, that it operated reliably, that it did not vary significantly based on local conditions, individual actors, or specific circumstances. Those are the characteristics of a system rather than a series of accidents. And systems, unlike accidents, have structures. They have inputs and outputs. They have the people and institutions that operate them. They have the purposes they were designed to serve. Identifying a consistent outcome is not the same as identifying the system that produced it, but it is the necessary first step toward doing so. The question that the 1907 case opened, what happened to the skull? Where did it go? Why is the record structure the way it is? Has expanded into a question about the system that produced the record structure. That system received material from across a wide geographic area over a significant span of decades. It produced, consistently, the same type of documentation absence at the same point in the processing sequence. It operated across categories of material, not just one, and it left behind, as its most durable legacy, not a collection of documented finds, but a collection of documented absences. What that system was, who operated it, and what purposes it served are questions the available evidence does not fully answer. But the evidence does establish that something consistent was operating, and consistent outcomes, produced reliably across decades in geography and categories of material, are not accidents. They are the product of design. What was designed and by whom, and to what end remains, for now, genuinely unclear. But the design itself, or at least its outline, is visible in the shape of what it left behind. When the available evidence does not produce a clear answer, the question of interpretation becomes unavoidable. And interpretation, by its nature, is not a single thing. Different researchers examining the same body of evidence, the same pattern of documentation failures, the same consistent absence at the same structural point in case after case, have reached different conclusions about what that pattern means and what produced it. Those different conclusions are not equally supported by the evidence, but none of them can be fully dismissed by it either. And understanding why requires looking at each interpretation carefully, on its own terms, before evaluating what the evidence actually allows. There are three principal interpretations that have emerged from serious examination of the 1907 case and the broader pattern surrounding it. They are not equally popular in academic circles. They do not carry equal institutional credibility, but they represent the genuine range of explanations that researchers have proposed, and each of them deserves to be examined for what it actually claims and what evidence it requires. The first interpretation is the most institutionally conventional. It describes what happened as straightforward institutional behavior, operating exactly as institutions of that era typically operated. Museums, scientific bodies, and government agencies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries functioned with a degree of autonomy and discretion that modern institutions, subject to transparency requirements and public accountability frameworks, do not typically enjoy. They collected aggressively. They made acquisition decisions based on internal criteria that were not publicly disclosed or externally reviewed. They documented selectively, preserving records of what they considered significant and not preserving records of what they considered routine or inconvenient. And they shared information on their own terms, releasing to the public what served their institutional purposes and retaining the rest within their own internal systems. Under this interpretation, the pattern of missing documentation is not a mystery at all. It is the predictable output of institutions that were never designed to be transparent in the first place. The absence of accessible public records for finds that were transferred to institutional custody reflects the standard operating practice of bodies that regarded their collections as proprietary. The finds were received. They were processed according to internal criteria. And if those criteria led the institution to classify the material in a way that did not generate public documentation, that outcome reflects institutional practice rather than anything more deliberate or unusual. This interpretation has genuine historical support. The acquisitive and opaque character of major scientific institutions in this period is well documented. The Smithsonian and similar bodies did operate with enormous discretion. They did collect without consistent public transparency, and the general absence of accessible public documentation for many categories of institutional acquisition from this era is a recognized feature of the historical record, not specific to any one type of find. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the institutional opacity explanation works better as a general framework than as a specific explanation for this particular pattern. General institutional opacity would predict that many categories of material from this period are poorly documented in the accessible public record. And that is true, but it would also predict variability. Some material would have survived with better documentation than others, depending on which institution received it, what internal criteria it applied, and how its records were subsequently preserved or made accessible. The specific and consistent truncation at the transfer point, across multiple institutions and multiple decades, requires the opacity to have been not just general but specifically uniform in its application to this category of material. And uniform application of opacity across independent institutions is itself something that requires explanation. The second interpretation moves beyond general institutional practice into something more specific. It focuses on what some researchers describe as deliberate narrative control, operating not through active conspiracy, but through the normal incentive structures of academic and scientific communities. The argument works as follows. By the late 19th century, a general framework for understanding human prehistory in North America had been established within the scientific community. That framework had institutional investment behind it. Careers had been built on it. Publications had been produced within it. Funding had been allocated according to its assumptions. And like any established framework, it created a set of implicit incentives that shaped how new evidence was received and processed. Findings that fit the established framework were publishable. They confirmed what was already believed and extended the existing body of knowledge in expected directions. Findings that complicated or contradicted the framework were more difficult to accommodate. Publishing them would require either modifying the framework, which involved significant institutional costs, or explaining away the contradiction, which required effort and generated controversy. The path of least resistance, available in the normal operation of any academic system with established consensus, was simply not to publish, not to formally investigate, to receive the material, note its existence internally, and allow it to remain in storage, where it would not generate the complications that public engagement would produce. Under this interpretation, there was no coordinated effort to suppress unusual finds. There was no institutional directive to prevent certain types of evidence from reaching the public. There was simply the normal operation of an academic incentive structure that consistently produced the same outcome for a specific category of material. Findings that challenged the established timeline were quietly shelved, not because anyone decided to shelve them, but because no one had sufficient incentive to do the work required to bring them forward. Some believe this explanation accounts for the pattern more precisely than general institutional opacity does. It explains why the truncation happened specifically at the institutional assessment point, rather than randomly across the documentation sequence. The material was received. The institution looked at it, and the institution's internal assessment, shaped by the prevailing framework and its associated incentives, produced a decision not to engage publicly with what had been found. The documentation of that decision was not preserved because the decision itself was never formalized. It was simply the absence of action rather than an action taken. Others disagree. They argue that the academic incentive structure explanation, while plausible for cases involving marginally anomalous finds, does not fully account for the scale of some material in this category. A find large enough and unusual enough to generate significant local attention would presumably have been difficult to simply set aside without generating at least some internal institutional debate. Internal debate leaves traces, and the absence of those traces from even the partially accessible institutional archives of the period suggests something beyond ordinary academic inertia. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because neither the institutional opacity interpretation nor the academic incentive structure interpretation fully accounts for the extension of the pattern into artifact cases, which was established in the previous examination of this evidence. Both interpretations are framed around how institutions handled material that complicated the established scientific framework. But unusual artifact cases that do not necessarily challenge any established timeline also show the same documentation pattern. The consistent truncation at the transfer point appears in cases where the material's anomalous character is not obviously related to questions about human prehistory. That broader application suggests the mechanism is more general than either of the first two interpretations proposes. The third interpretation takes a fundamentally different approach. It is less academic in origin and carries less institutional credibility than the first two, but it is present in the research on this topic and cannot be responsibly omitted from a complete accounting of the interpretive landscape. This interpretation argues that the scale of certain finds from this period, including the 1907 skull, represents physical evidence of a prior human population whose existence contradicts the current established framework for human history in North America. Under this view, the material is not merely anomalous in minor ways. It is evidence of something that the established framework has no category for and cannot accommodate without fundamental revision. And the silence surrounding it is not the product of institutional opacity or academic inertia. It is the product of an ongoing and deliberate effort to prevent that evidence from entering the public domain. This interpretation requires accepting several claims that the available evidence does not directly support. It requires accepting that the 1907 skull and similar finds represent what they appeared to the workers who found them to represent, rather than misidentified natural formations. It requires accepting that the institutional system that received this material identified its significance and made a conscious decision to suppress it. And it requires accepting that this suppression has been maintained consistently across more than a century, across multiple administrations, multiple institutional leaderships, and multiple generations of researchers. Those are significant requirements, and the available evidence does not confirm any of them. The workers' accounts, however consistent, do not constitute scientific verification of what the material actually was. The institutional behavior, however opaque, is not confirmed as deliberate suppression by any document that has been located. And the maintenance of consistent suppression over a century is a claim that requires a degree of coordinated institutional control that is difficult to demonstrate with the available record. But this is where the third interpretation connects to something that the first two also share. None of the three interpretations can be confirmed by the available evidence, and none of them can be fully disproven by it either. That symmetry is not accidental. It is a direct consequence of the documentation pattern itself. The absence of records that would settle the question is what creates the space in which all three interpretations remain viable simultaneously. If the complete transfer records existed, the institutional opacity interpretation could be evaluated against them. If the internal assessment documents existed, the academic incentive structure interpretation could be tested. If any verified analysis of the physical material existed, the third interpretation could be directly addressed. None of those documents exist in accessible form, and their absence is what prevents any of the three interpretations from being moved from the category of possible explanation into the category of confirmed account. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the evidentiary situation that leaves all three interpretations simultaneously viable is not a neutral condition. It is itself a product of the documentation pattern. The pattern does not just describe what happened to the physical material. It describes what happened to the information about the physical material, and information that has been consistently absent from the accessible record for more than a century is information that cannot be used to evaluate the competing explanations for its own absence. That is a specific kind of epistemic situation. It is not simply a case of insufficient evidence. It is a case where the evidence that would resolve the question is precisely the evidence that the pattern has removed from accessibility. The missing records are not missing by coincidence. They are missing at the exact points where they would be most useful for evaluating what happened. And that specificity is what keeps the question open regardless of which interpretive framework is applied to it. Some researchers find this situation deeply frustrating. Others find it informative in its own right. The record that would settle the question does not appear to exist in any publicly accessible form. That is a statement about the current state of the evidence. It is not a conclusion about what the evidence, if it existed, would show, but it is a precise description of where the investigation currently stands. Three interpretations, no confirmed answer, and a documentation pattern that has ensured, for more than a century, that the confirmed answer remains out of reach. So where does this leave us? That is the honest question at this point. Not where does it leave the mystery, or where does it leave the theories, but where does it leave the actual investigation? The one that started with a specific event in a specific place in a specific year and gradually expanded into something much larger than any single case can contain. Where does an investigation go when the evidence it needs is consistently absent, when the pattern it has identified does not resolve into a confirmed explanation, and when the question at its center remains as open as it was at the beginning? It leaves us with what the evidence actually shows, not what it suggests, not what it might imply under one interpretation or another, but what it demonstrably and verifiably shows. And being precise about that is important, because the temptation at this stage of any investigation is to let the accumulated weight of unanswered questions push toward a conclusion that the evidence has not actually earned. What the evidence shows is this. A discovery was made in 1907. Workers were present. They described something large and structured beneath the ground. Their descriptions, while not scientifically verified, were consistent across independent accounts in ways that simple misidentification through pareidolia does not fully explain. Reports were written. Those reports entered the local documentary record in a limited but traceable form. An outside representative arrived at the site, identified in a single surviving account as being connected to an Eastern scientific institution, unnamed, unidentified, his findings unpublished. The physical material was transferred somewhere, and the documentation that should follow a find of that scale, in that era, through the institutional channels that were actively operating at the time, does not surface in any publicly accessible archive that researchers have been able to examine. That is what the evidence shows. It is a specific and limited set of confirmed facts. Everything beyond those facts is interpretation, inference, or the observation of absence. And absence, as has been noted throughout this examination, is not evidence of any specific thing. It is the space where evidence should be and is not. The geological explanation remains available. The concretion and pareidolia framework is scientifically grounded. Its application to the 1907 case is reasonable on general principles, even if it cannot be specifically verified against the actual material, because the actual material is not accessible for verification. The misidentification argument is plausible. Workers in 1907 were not trained observers. Conditions were poor. Excitement distorts perception. These qualifications are real and honest, and cannot be dismissed simply because the explanation they support is inconvenient for a more interesting narrative. The record-keeping failures of that era are also real. Rural communities in the early 20th century did not maintain the kind of systematic archival infrastructure that would allow every unusual event to be traced cleanly from beginning to end. Documents were lost. Follow-up was inconsistent. Institutional correspondence was incomplete. These are genuine features of the historical environment and they account for a significant portion of the missing documentation that surrounds not just the 1907 case, but dozens of similar cases from the same period. But this is where it becomes unclear, because reasonable explanations and verified explanations are not the same thing. An explanation can be reasonable, can be grounded in real science and real historical context, and still not be confirmed as the actual explanation for a specific case. The geological explanation is reasonable. The record-keeping failure explanation is reasonable. What neither of them is, in the context of the 1907 case, is specifically verified against the actual evidence of what happened. And the reason they cannot be specifically verified is that the evidence required for verification is precisely what is absent from the record. That circularity is not a minor inconvenience. It is the central structural feature of this case, and of the broader pattern surrounding it. The explanations that would settle the question require the documentation that the pattern has consistently failed to produce. And the documentation that the pattern has consistently failed to produce is exactly what would allow the competing explanations to be evaluated against each other and resolved. The case cannot be closed because the closing record does not exist. And the closing record does not exist in a way that is itself consistent with a pattern of closing records not existing for this category of find. However, the timeline does not fully match a simple picture of ordinary historical incompleteness, because ordinary historical incompleteness does not produce this degree of consistency across this many independent cases over this many decades. That has been established. The pattern is real. The consistency is real. And the consistency requires an explanation that the available evidence has not yet provided. What the pattern surrounding the 1907 case connects to, in the broader contemporary landscape, is worth stating clearly even if the connection cannot be causally proven. The system that handles what comes out of the ground in the United States has been operating for a very long time. It did not begin in 1907. It did not end there. And its operation in the present day is not invisible. It is documented, publicly reported, and in some respects legally codified. Approximately 90,000 Native American ancestral remains currently sit in institutional storage across the United States. That number is not an estimate produced by advocates. It is derived from the ProPublica Repatriation Project database, which covers more than 600 institutions and draws on federally required reporting. The law that required their return was passed in 1990. Congress estimated at the time that compliance would take 10 years. It is now more than 3 decades past that estimate, and the majority of those remains have not been returned. They sit in storage rooms in museums, universities, and federal facilities. Not displayed, not actively studied in most cases, not returned, stored. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Because the system that is currently holding 90,000 remains in storage, decades after the law required their return, is the same institutional system that received unusual finds in the early 20th century and produced the documentation pattern that this investigation has been examining. It is not a different system that happened to produce a similar outcome. It is the same system, operating across a longer time frame, producing a consistent outcome that is now a matter of public record rather than historical inference. The consistency between the historical pattern and the contemporary situation does not prove that the historical pattern had the same causes as the contemporary one. That would be an overreach. But it does establish that the institutional infrastructure for receiving, holding, and controlling access to material that comes out of the ground has been operating continuously and has been producing outcomes characterized by restricted access and incomplete public documentation for considerably longer than the 1907 case alone would suggest. Discovery sites have been physically altered before independent researchers could access them. That is also documented. The Kennewick Man case established it clearly. The Army Corps of Engineers buried the riverbank under nearly 2,000 metric tons of rock and planted fast-growing trees, specifically designed to penetrate and destroy organic material below the surface before Congress could authorize independent examination of the site. That action was taken by a federal agency in a publicly documented case within the last 3 decades. The mechanism that buries discovery sites is not a historical artifact. It is a contemporary institutional capability that has been used within living memory.